Welcome to Urban Lullabies, where mysteries drift into the quiet corners of your night. Tonight, we invite you to settle in and listen to a story not born from folklore, but from history, an enduring enigma that begins in the warm glow of Christmas lights and ends in a silence that has echoed for nearly 8 decades. This is the true account of the Sodder children, a family shattered by fire, bound by unanswered questions, and remembered through the relentless search for truth. Let your mind wander, your breath slow. And as the night deepens, we begin. Fayetteville, West Virginia, in the 1940s, was the kind of place that folded into itself after sundown. A small, tightly knit coal town tucked in the Appalachian foothills, where doors weren't often locked, and everybody knew the contours of everybody else's business. The war had ended only months earlier. Soldiers were returning to mine shafts and classrooms. Victory gardens were wilting into fallow earth. And in the middle of all of this stood the Sodders, a family both admired and quietly watched. George Sodder was born Giorgio Soddu in Tula, Sardinia, Italy, around 1895. Like many immigrants at the turn of the century, he came to America as a teenager in search of something better. He dropped the "U" from his name, anglicized his identity, and made his way through Pennsylvania's rail yards before settling in Fayetteville. He was ambitious, independent, and sharp-minded, a man who ran his own trucking business hauling coal and construction materials. Over the years, he grew comfortable, even prosperous. Jenny Cipriani Sodder, his wife, was also of Italian descent, but born in America. Together, George and Jenny had 10 children. Theirs was a large, lively household, and the Sodder home was a fixture in the area. Yet despite their apparent assimilation, George's views and history carried friction. He was vocal about his hatred for Mussolini, Italy's fascist dictator, a dangerous stance in a time when Italian-American identity was still tender and politicized. Within their local Italian community, this made George controversial. Perhaps even resented. West Virginia at the time was a landscape defined by contrast, tight family values and a rugged survivalist ethos, set against lingering distrust of immigrants, especially those who didn't fully conform. The Sodders stood out, not just because they were Italian, but because George refused to back down, and because they were successful. And success, in a town like Fayetteville, could sometimes draw more suspicion than praise. The broader post-war American psyche added more fuel. The country was adjusting, nervously, to its new role as a global superpower. The war had shifted societal norms, gender roles, economic conditions. Trauma lingered just beneath the surface. For many, especially in rural areas, change bred uncertainty, and uncertainty bred fear. It is against this backdrop, a family with a loud patriarch, a foreign past, and a wealth built by hard work, that the Sodder story begins. Not with mystery or fire, but with the uneasy reality of being both familiar and foreign. Of being seen, but not always trusted. And it is this tension, of community, of culture, of quiet judgment, that would set the stage for one of the most enduring and haunting missing persons cases in American history. Christmas Eve should have been ordinary. By all accounts, it began that way. The Sodder family was gathered in their 2-story timber frame home on Route 16, just outside Fayetteville Center. 10 children had once lived under that roof. One son, Joe, was away serving in the military. Another, John, was 17 and helping with the family business. On that night, 9 children were home. They decorated a Christmas tree, exchanged laughter, and prepared for midnight Massachusetts. The war was over. Peace felt tangible. Around 9 p.m., Jenny allowed some of the younger children, Maurice, 14, Martha, 12, Louis, 9, Jenny, 8, and Betty, 5, to stay up late playing with toys. Marion, one of the older daughters, had surprised the family with gifts from a part-time job in town. The children were overjoyed. The mood was warm. At around 10 p.m., Jenny told the younger kids it was time for bed. George and 2 older sons, John and George Jr., had already gone to sleep. Jenny herself dozed off in the master bedroom downstairs with Sylvia, the youngest child, just 2 years old, beside her. Then the strange events began. Shortly after midnight, the phone rang. Jenny awoke and answered. On the line was a woman she didn't recognize, asking for someone Jenny didn't know. Laughter and clinking glasses echoed in the background, clearly a holiday party. Jenny politely informed the caller she had the wrong number. But she later recalled something odd. The woman had laughed in a peculiar way. Not amused. Unsettling. Jenny then noticed the house was quiet, too quiet. The lights were still on. The front door was unlocked. The curtains were open. And the children, who had promised to sleep in the attic room, were nowhere to be seen. Assuming they'd simply gone to bed upstairs, Jenny turned off the lights and returned to sleep. She was awoken again, around 1 a.m., by a loud thump on the roof, followed by what she described as a rolling sound. Nothing more. Silence. At approximately 1:30 a.m., Jenny smelled smoke. Rushing out of bed, she found the office room, where George kept his business equipment, ablaze. Flames licked the walls and crept toward the staircase. She screamed for George. The family scrambled. George, Jenny, and 4 of the children escaped into the cold night. But 5 remained trapped, or so it seemed. George tried everything. He broke a window to re-enter the house and cut his hand in the process. The stairs to the attic were engulfed. He raced to fetch his ladder to reach the attic window, but the ladder was missing. Then he tried to start both of his cold trucks to drive them beside the house and climb up. Neither started, though they had been working fine the day before. A bucket of water from a rain barrel was frozen solid. The phone line had been cut. The fire department was called, but no one answered. A neighbor ran to town to find the fire chief. Another drove to a nearby tavern with a phone. But the response was agonizingly slow. The fire chief did not drive the fire truck himself and had to wait for a team. It would be 7 hours before firefighters arrived. By then, the Sodder home was a pile of ashes. And 5 children, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty, were nowhere to be found. Not in the ruins. Not in the smoke. Not in the earth. Nowhere. At the heart of this haunting case lies not just a mystery, but a family, wounded, driven, and complex. To understand how the Sodder disappearance evolved from a tragedy into a lifelong crusade, we must understand the Sodders themselves. George Sodder, born Giorgio Soddu, the patriarch. George was not a man who folded easily. Sardinian by birth, he had arrived in the United States at age 13, alone. By adulthood, he'd carved out a life from hard labor, eventually owning a successful trucking company. He had a reputation in Fayetteville for being meticulous and proud. He paid his bills in cash, spoke plainly, and built his fortune without owing anyone favors. But George also had enemies, or, at the very least, people who distrusted him. He was openly anti-fascist during a time when some in the Italian-American community still supported Mussolini. He spoke about it frequently and refused to fly the Italian flag. This earned him respect from some and quiet hostility from others. In the wake of the fire, George became consumed with finding the truth. He was not a man content with maybes. His grief was expressed through action, billboards, private investigators, digging through ashes with his own hands. He refused to believe the children had died, and his persistence made him both an object of admiration and skepticism. Jenny Sodder, the matriarch. Jenny was born in the U.S. to Italian immigrants and was by all accounts deeply intelligent, devout, and composed under pressure. Unlike George, her grief was quieter, more intuitive, but no less enduring. She was haunted by practical inconsistencies, the smell of burning flesh she never noticed, the fact that household appliances had survived the blaze while human bones had not. She questioned everything. Jenny tested these doubts herself, burning animal bones in her own oven to see if they would disintegrate like her children's were said to have. They didn't. She wrote letters, tracked clues, read everything. If George was the engine of the search, Jenny was its compass. The children. 10 Sodder children were born between 1923 and 1943. At the time of the fire, 5 were considered to have perished. Maurice, 14, quiet, dependable, and helped with the trucking business. Martha, 12, known for her empathy and closeness to her siblings. Louis, 9, energetic, curious, and inseparable from Maurice. Jenny Jr., 8, named after her mother, she had a sharp mind. Betty, 5, the youngest of the missing, playful and adored. The surviving children included John, 23, and George Jr., 16, both helped with the family business. Marion, 17, the oldest daughter, working in a local dime store. Sylvia, 2, the youngest child, spared by age and chance. Each surviving child carried their trauma differently. Sylvia, though just a toddler during the fire, would grow into one of the most vocal advocates for continuing the search well into adulthood. Marion struggled with guilt over not insisting her younger siblings sleep downstairs. John and George Jr. seemed more reserved in later years, their memories private. A family transformed. After the fire, the Sodders became something more than a grieving family. They became investigators, advocates, and mythic figures in a story that would captivate and divide a nation. Their persistence was admirable, but it was also isolating. Friends turned away. Officials stopped returning calls. Their unwavering belief that their children had been taken, not lost to fire, made them outliers. But George and Jenny never stopped. Not until their final days. In the immediate aftermath of the fire, the official response was inconsistent at best, and, at worst, deeply negligent. The Sodder home had been reduced to a smoldering shell by dawn on Christmas morning, but what followed was not a coordinated recovery. It was confusion, silence, and procedural shortcuts that would echo for decades. Delayed fire response. The first major irregularity was the delay in the fire department's arrival. Despite calls being placed around 1:45 a.m., firefighters did not reach the site until nearly 8 a.m., over 6 hours after the fire had already consumed the house. The fire chief, F.J. Morris, claimed he couldn't drive the fire truck himself and had to wait until enough men were available. By the time they arrived, there was nothing left to save or investigate. The lack of urgency was chalked up to small-town limitations. But to the Sodders, it reeked of disinterest or something worse, indifference. No bodies found. The most damning piece of the puzzle was this: no remains were found. 5 children were supposedly trapped in an inferno, yet not a single bone, tooth, or fragment was ever recovered. The official explanation was that the fire had been hot enough to incinerate their bodies completely. Jenny Sodder never believed this. She consulted a local crematorium and was told that human bones do not disintegrate in a typical house fire. Even at temperatures much higher than those in the Sodder home, bones persist, as do dental fillings and fragments. She tested this herself by burning chicken bones and pork chops in a wood stove. They never fully vanished. Rushed conclusion. Within just a few days, local authorities concluded the fire was caused by faulty wiring and that the 5 children had perished in the flames. The coroner's jury ruled accidental death. But the signs of a more complex event were everywhere. The ladder that George always kept propped against the house was found 75 feet away in a ditch. The phone line had been cut, not burned. A repairman confirmed this. The coal trucks, used daily by George for work, failed to start, despite being in good condition the day before. A neighbor reported seeing a strange man on the property a few weeks earlier, asking about work, and then examining the fuse box behind the house. George and Jenny began to suspect that the fire had been set intentionally, and that the children may have been taken beforehand, or during the chaos. The fire chief's confession. Chief Morris would later tell the Sodders, privately, that he had found a heart in the ashes, placed it in a metal box, and buried it at the site. This claim was highly suspicious. The box was later exhumed and sent to a funeral director, who found it contained nothing but beef liver, untouched by fire. Many believe Morris planted it to appease the family or discourage further digging. No forensic investigator was brought in. The site was never cordoned off. And just a few days later, George bulldozed the ruins, hoping to turn the land into a memorial garden. This action, done in grief and desperation, unfortunately destroyed much of what little physical evidence remained. To the outside world, the case was closed. To the Sodders, it was just beginning. The fire had been ruled an accident. The children had been declared dead. But for George and Jenny Sodder, those conclusions were unthinkable. In their hearts, their 5 missing children had not perished in the fire, they had vanished into something far more complicated, more insidious, and harder to name. And so began a transformation, from grief-stricken parents into dogged investigators. Their lives would no longer revolve around daily routines, business, or holiday gatherings. They would orbit a single, burning question: what happened to our children? The search begins. In the days after the fire, George and Jenny began noticing things that didn't add up, objects out of place, odd behavior from townspeople, and subtle omissions from official accounts. That dissonance fueled a gnawing certainty that the fire had not killed their children. They began to ask questions. To write letters. They reached out to anyone who would listen: local police, the governor, the FBI. The initial responses were polite, then perfunctory. Eventually, they stopped coming altogether. But George and Jenny didn't stop. The billboard. By 1952, 7 years after the fire, George erected a large billboard along Route 16, just south of Fayetteville. The message was stark and direct. What was their fate? Kidnapped? Murdered? Or are they still alive? Followed by the names and ages of the 5 missing children. This billboard became a landmark, not just in Fayette County, but in the wider American consciousness. It was one of the earliest examples of a private citizen using media to campaign for answers in a missing persons case. For years, travelers would pull over, read it, and take flyers. George replaced the billboard repeatedly as it aged. It was his anchor, his voice when institutions refused to speak. It stood for decades, until the 1980s, and was visible proof that the Sodders would not let the world forget. Leads and sightings. Over the years, the Sodders received dozens, perhaps hundreds, of alleged sightings and clues. A woman claimed to have seen the children in a car passing through Charleston, West Virginia, just after the fire. A hotel maid in Charleston reported seeing 4 children with 2 adults, who refused to let them speak. A letter arrived from New York. A woman claimed one of the girls was living in a convent. Another tip came from Florida. Jenny chased all of them, some in person, others through hired detectives. None panned out. But one of the strangest moments came in 1967, when the Sodders received a photograph in the mail. It was postmarked from Kentucky and unsigned. On the back, in careful handwriting, was the message. Louis Sodder. I love brother Frankie. Illo boys. A 90132, or 90135. The photo showed a man in his 20s with dark, familiar features, close enough to what Louis might look like. The family was electrified. They hired another PI to investigate, but the man vanished and was never heard from again. Still, the photo was mounted on the wall of their home, next to the billboard replica, until their deaths. Unyielding devotion. The Sodder parents never gave up. George died in 1969, Jenny in 1989. Both went to their graves believing their children had not died in the fire but had been kidnapped, and perhaps had lived on, somewhere, waiting to be found. Their surviving children, especially Sylvia, would carry the torch in later years. And while they never discovered definitive proof, they succeeded in something else: they refused to let the world forget. What began as a tragedy became something more, a public mystery, a family's legacy, and one of the most enduring unsolved cases in American history. As the years passed and the official explanation frayed, people began to speculate. If the Sodder children didn't die in the fire, then what happened to them? The Sodders themselves were open to nearly any theory that did not end in ash. Their desperation didn't make them gullible. They sought expert advice, cross-referenced facts, and dismissed many false leads. But they remained open to the possibility that something darker and more complex had occurred. Theories surrounding the Sodder case range from the scientifically plausible to the bizarre and conspiratorial. Here, we'll examine the most prominent. 1. The fire was too weak to destroy the bodies. This is the cornerstone of the Sodders' doubt. Forensic experts and crematorium directors told Jenny Sodder that house fires, even hot ones, rarely reach the necessary temperatures to incinerate human bone completely. Bones are incredibly resilient. Crematoriums operate at around 1,400 to 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit for over 2 hours to reduce remains to ash. The Sodder house fire, based on eyewitness accounts and the fire's duration, less than 45 minutes of peak burn, likely never reached those extremes. Moreover, household appliances like a stove and parts of furniture were still identifiable in the wreckage. So why not bone? Why no teeth? No hair, no fragments, no blood? This remains the most compelling factual basis for doubting the official narrative. 2. The children were kidnapped, but why? If the children didn't die in the fire, the next obvious question is, were they taken? Some believe the fire was used as a distraction or cover-up. Several peculiar details support this. A stranger had visited the Sodder home months prior asking about the family's electrical panel. He later told George, ominously, "This house is going to go up in smoke." A ladder was moved far from the house, possibly to prevent rescue. George's trucks wouldn't start, as if tampered with to delay escape. The family received strange letters and threats prior to the fire, some reportedly connected to George's anti-Mussolini views. One theory suggests that members of the Italian mafia, offended by George's outspoken politics or refusal to pay for protection, orchestrated the kidnapping. The children were either taken for leverage, or worse. But the mafia explanation raises its own problems. Why leave the family alive? Why not take one child? Why execute such a brazen plan in rural West Virginia? 3. The children were trafficked or rehomed. Another possibility is that the children were kidnapped for illegal adoption or trafficking. This theory is supported by some of the alleged post-fire sightings, children resembling the Sodders seen with adults who refuse to speak to police. This idea aligns with certain patterns in child abduction rings known to operate in the U.S. during the 20th century. In these scenarios, the fire would have served as a clean break, destroying not just a home, but the legal identities of the missing children. But again, no hard evidence emerged. No one came forward. No paper trail. No whistleblower. 4. The photo of Louis, a clue or cruel joke. The 1967 photo mailed to the Sodders, purporting to show a grown-up Louis, remains one of the most tantalizing mysteries of the case. Handwriting experts were inconclusive. The man in the photo resembled Louis, but no absolute match could be made. Some believe it was genuine, a message sent in code by a grown child who had been raised elsewhere. Others think it was a hoax designed to further torment the family. Regardless, it reignited hope, and prolonged agony. 5. The fire was truly accidental. The least sensational theory remains the one endorsed by the authorities, that the fire was electrical, the children died quickly, and the bodies were simply consumed more thoroughly than usual. This explanation depends heavily on the idea of closure. It provides a tragic, but natural end. No conspiracies, no kidnapping, just chaos, smoke, and grief. But it does not satisfy the details. Why were the phone lines cut, not burned? Why was the ladder moved? Why did no one see or hear the children scream? The official story may offer a tidy conclusion, but it fails to hold under close scrutiny. Each theory opens more questions than it answers. And in that uncertainty, the legend of the Sodder children endures, not just as a story of loss, but as a reminder of how easily truth can become buried in silence, smoke, and time. From the moment the Sodder house turned to ash, the official handling of the case raised eyebrows. Law enforcement's actions, or inactions, ranged from sluggish to evasive, leading many to wonder, were they simply overwhelmed, or was something being quietly suppressed? The initial investigation, shallow and rushed. Fayette County authorities ruled quickly and with finality. The children had died in the fire, which was attributed to faulty wiring. But this conclusion was drawn without an exhaustive search, without forensic evidence, and without independent verification. No coroner or pathologist examined the scene in any meaningful way. No forensic anthropologist sifted through the rubble for remains. The entire investigation was wrapped up in a matter of days. To make matters worse, George Sodder bulldozed the site shortly after the fire, a decision made out of despair, and encouraged by some officials. Though done with the intent of creating a memorial garden, this act effectively eliminated any remaining chance for a proper forensic analysis. Police, passive or complicit? Local police played a frustratingly passive role. Reports of strange cars, suspicious visitors, and threatening behavior toward the Sodder family were not investigated seriously, if at all. Consider this. George had been threatened by a life insurance salesman, who said his house would go up in smoke and his children would be destroyed. A telephone repairman confirmed that the Sodders' phone line had been cut, not burned. Neighbors saw a man stealing a block and tackle from the property the night of the fire. Each of these details, in isolation, might be overlooked. Taken together, they form a damning pattern, and yet, authorities showed little interest. Why? Some suggest institutional incompetence. Others point to a small-town dynamic where power and influence could quietly shift the course of an investigation. The FBI's brief involvement. In 1947, 2 years after the fire, the Sodders contacted J. Edgar Hoover directly. Hoover replied. He expressed sympathy, and offered FBI assistance, if local authorities requested it. Fayette County officials declined. Hoover's office followed up, but ultimately withdrew from the case citing jurisdictional limitations. Despite this, the FBI remained a quiet figure in the Sodder narrative, periodically reviewing letters or photos the family submitted. To many observers, the FBI's exit felt like abandonment. To the Sodders, it was yet another door closed before the truth could be found. Media coverage, from dismissive to curious. At first, the story stayed local. Newspapers framed the fire as a tragedy, but not a mystery. The children were presumed dead, and few questioned the official account. But the Sodders didn't let it end there. As they erected billboards, placed classified ads, and mailed flyers, their campaign drew national attention. By the 1950s and 60s, syndicated columns and radio programs began to cover the case. Public interest swelled. The idea of 5 children vanishing without a trace, paired with the family's fierce refusal to accept the narrative, was compelling. Yet coverage was mixed. Some outlets cast the Sodders as grieving parents clinging to false hope. Others saw them as victims of a systemic failure to protect the vulnerable. The media eventually turned the Sodder case into something larger than a missing persons investigation. It became a symbol of unresolved grief, of institutional distrust, and of the sometimes porous line between truth and legend. The Sodder children were never found. No bones. No confirmed sightings. No definitive answers. And yet, their absence continues to haunt, etched into road signs, internet forums, and the memories of a family who refused to stop searching. But what is it about this story that refuses to settle, even decades after the fire went cold? Psychological aftermath, the family that would not mourn. For George and Jenny Sodder, moving on was never an option. George's grief was volcanic, constantly active beneath a surface of stoicism. He died in 1969, having exhausted himself on dead leads and private investigations. Jenny lived until 1989, spending her later years reclusive, always dressed in black, as if in mourning not just for the dead, but for the truth. Their surviving children grew up in the shadow of the mystery. Sylvia, only 2 at the time of the fire, became the unofficial keeper of the family's hope. Into her 70s, she continued to give interviews, answer letters, and advocate for new investigation. She maintained that her siblings had not perished in the fire, and that someone, somewhere, knew what happened. That certainty became a defining trait of the Sodders. They were unwilling to be consoled by convenience. Cultural impact, a mystery that became myth. The Sodder case has become a touchstone in American folklore, a story retold again and again in podcasts, television specials, and unsolved mysteries anthologies. The imagery is potent. 5 children vanish in a fire with no trace, and the parents respond by building a billboard visible for miles, demanding answers. It captures something primal, parental devotion in the face of bureaucratic indifference, and the maddening power of ambiguity. The case also serves as a kind of cautionary tale. About trusting institutions. About how fragile justice can be when authority acts carelessly. And about the enduring ache of unanswered questions. Why the story endures. At its core, the Sodder case is about loss without closure. And the human mind struggles with that. When grief has no body, no grave, and no answer, it creates a vacuum, one that myths, conspiracies, and desperate hope inevitably rush to fill. Was it foul play? Was it a terrible accident made worse by incompetence? Or was it something stranger still? In the absence of facts, the story breathes, like smoke from a fire that never quite goes out. The unanswerable questions that remain. Why were no remains ever found? Who cut the phone lines and moved the ladder? Why did 2 trucks fail on the night of the fire? Who mailed the photo of Louis, and why? And most important, could 5 children truly disappear without a trace? The Sodders were not conspiracy theorists. They were ordinary people, blue-collar immigrants, who were failed by those meant to protect them. Their quest was never sensationalism. It was love, grief, and the need to understand what happened to their family. That's what makes the story powerful. And that's what makes it endure. The disappearance of the Sodder children is not just a story, it is a window into a moment in American history, into the complexities of grief, and into the painful consequences of uncertainty. It defies easy resolution because it was never allowed to have one. More than 75 years have passed since the night the Sodder home burned to the ground. The physical house is gone, the parents long buried, and the billboard that once demanded answers has been dismantled. But the questions remain. And so do the lessons. Lesson 1, the fragility of closure. For the Sodders, the state's conclusion, that their 5 children died in the fire, was not an end but a wall. An official truth that rang false. Their rejection of that truth was not denial, it was discernment. They knew something wasn't right. Closure, we often think, is something institutions can deliver. But in this case, the Sodders remind us that closure is earned, not given. Without transparency, diligence, and care, even the most well-meaning conclusions become suspect. Lesson 2, the power and cost of persistence. Few families could have sustained the kind of lifelong campaign that George and Jenny Sodder mounted. Their tenacity was remarkable, and exhausting. It came at the cost of friendships, reputation, and emotional peace. But in doing so, they reshaped the narrative. Their voices ensured that the disappearance of their children would not be reduced to a footnote. They forced the world to look again. Persistence does not always yield answers, but it can force a kind of justice, the justice of remembrance. Lesson 3, systemic failures leave long shadows. This story is not just about a mysterious fire. It is also about official negligence, a botched investigation, a reluctant police force, and missed opportunities for meaningful action. Had the fire scene been properly examined? Had the reports of suspicious activity been pursued? Had the FBI been allowed to intervene? We might have clarity today. Instead, we have a case study in how small decisions, made quickly or carelessly, can echo across generations. Lesson 4, truth isn't always discoverable, but the search still matters. To this day, no one knows what happened to Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny Jr., and Betty Sodder. That is a hard truth to accept. But their parents' search, and their siblings' continuation of it, created something profound, a story that refuses to be forgotten. In a world that often moves too fast to honor the unresolved, the Sodder story asks us to slow down, to consider the silences, to question what we're told. That act of remembrance, of bearing witness to uncertainty, is its own form of justice. Final thoughts. There is a reason the Sodder case has lived on. It contains the elements of tragedy, mystery, defiance, and love. But more than that, it reminds us of something essential. That sometimes, refusing to accept the official line is not a sign of delusion, but of devotion. As long as there are people willing to ask what happened to the Sodder children, people willing to search and remember, they are not truly lost. They are part of us. Still. And so we close the story of the Sodder children, one of loss, of longing, and of a family's refusal to forget. In the flicker of memory and unanswered questions, their voices still linger, like faint echoes in the ashes. If this story moved you, we invite you to leave a comment below. What mysteries should we explore next? Until then, may your night be quiet, your thoughts at ease, and your dreams untouched by smoke. This has been Urban Lullabies. Thank you for listening.